And for more on the fight against terrorism by the BRICS countries, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Yang Mingjie, who is the Vice President of China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Moscow, we have security analyst Pavel Felgenhauer with us. Welcome. And in New Delhi, we are joined by TCA Rangatari, who is the former Indian ambassador to Algeria, Germany, and France. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, before we go to how the BRICS countries can work together to fight against terrorism, let me ask you this, Mr. Yang. You are the expert here in China about terrorism fighting in this country. We understand most recently, the news is China took out 181 terrorist cells from Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region alone. The question is, how widespread is terrorism now in our country?
I think that there are three trends of the use the word proliferation of terrorism cells in China. One is that they moved from Xinjiang, from the bordering area to some inner city like Beijing and Guangzhou. Another trend is that they make some linkage with foreign countries. For example, we found that from the year of last year, there are some people fled from China and to other countries in Southeast Asia countries. We also found there are another trend that some international terrorism, they pay some attention on China. So that three trends, I think, is very dangerous for national security issues.
That's absolutely dangerous. On the other hand, we noticed in the media reports, according to the Chinese police, 96% of these terrorist cells, before they were arrested, actually have been joining the plotting, but before the final attack. What does it say about the capabilities of Chinese police in handling terrorism? And what does it also say about the active, it seems, scenes of terrorism, at least among some in China?
I think first the reports show the capabilities is enhancing of the Chinese policemen. They have enhancing their intelligence gathering and also show their capabilities to make some crackdown on some terrorism cells before the final attacks. Another, I think, the capabilities of the people, which means that we can see that maybe over half of them are reported by the people and by the society and by the communities. So that means the linkage between the law enforcement units and the local social communities. That is a thing that I think give examples of the Chinese counterterrorism policy and also our road.
Mr. Felgenhauer from Russia, does that kinds of practices sound familiar to you? What do you think the BRICS countries, when gathered together, can really learn from each other's lessons and experiences? Russia certainly has a say here.
Well, the fight against terrorism is something that can unite everyone. Basically, in security issues, the BRICS countries are a rather diverse group. Say there's hard to find common security ground, say, between South Africa, Brazil, and Russia or India. But fighting security is a common issue. Fighting terrorism. Terrorism threatens all. And of course, that's why it most likely was chosen as a platform to unite everyone against a common enemy.
But what about when it comes to experiences and lessons? You certainly have in Russia fight against terrorism for quite some years. Do you think China can learn something from it? And do you believe that some of the root causes of terrorism, both inside Russia and now in China, have something in common, particularly when it comes to the sources of extremism that has led to terrorism in these two countries? Mr. Felgenhauer.
Well, fighting terrorism is always an uphill job. If the terrorist groups have a base of operation, if they have established terrorism infrastructure, they can, despite heavy blows from the security services, they can almost always hit back. Say in Russia, Moscow in recent years has been, well, almost terrorist attack free, but in the North Caucasus, their terrorist attacks have continued, the same as in China, where say Beijing is say free of terrorist attack more or less, but in the Uyghur and autonomous region and in Xinjiang, there are serious problems. terrorism can be suppressed. There's either by total elimination, physical elimination of terrorist groups. There were examples, say, like the Baader-Meinhof Rote Army Fraktion or the Rote brigades in Italy that were actually eliminated. And there's, of course, transferring terrorist groups into legitimate political movements like the IRA. Only such a result can actually bring this long battle to a full conclusion, and that's not easy to achieve. And of course there can be exchange. In Russia there were changes in Chechnya where Russian authorities used former rebels and maybe even terrorists to fight other terrorists, so kind of taking on board part of the terrorist movements and transforming them is a very important tactic, and that's could be what Russia could help China to do too.
Mr. Yang, do you agree with these, shall we say, technologies or ways of doing things?
I think technology is important, but it's not the biggest important for us. What we can learn from each other, I think, for China, the first is the legislation is so important. So that's why our People's National Congress is talking about the counterterrorism law, because we have to make our law enforcement operation by law, not by people or by technology. Second, we can learn that the international experience is how could we cooperate and coordinate with each other. Because terrorism is not just a separate attack to each other. So we are facing the common enemies. We can learn that we need consult, coordinate, and cooperation that was raised by BRICS summit. I think that's very important.
But one of the things that both of you mentioned is the spread of terrorism as a result of some of the recent political events going on around the world. In fact, the Russian the Russian President, Mr. Putin, also talked about this. He said some of the terrorist groups, especially ISIL, has not prospered in places that there are wars, particularly interference from the outside. Let me go to our Indian guest, Ragatari. Mr. Ragatari, how do you comment about these kinds of growth of terrorism as a result of political events and chaos and the vacancy of political powers in certain countries? Can we, BRICS countries, be able to unite and deal with that?
Well, as far as the BRICS countries are concerned, of course, yes, they have a common objective, and that is to combat terrorism. In the specific case that you are mentioning in regard to the ISIS or ISIL, the problem there is a bit more complicated, because when we talk in terms of outside forces, there are forces which are ideological in nature, which provide financial support. Then there are organizations which extend support. So in order to be able to target these different factors, it is necessary that the international community should have a common goal. There are a number of UN resolutions on the subject which says that terrorism in any form for any cause is unacceptable, and then we should not make any exceptions. And in the specific cases that were earlier being discussed in regard to China and in regard to Russia, they are country specific, and every country will have its own experience. For example, in the case of India, the biggest problem that we are confronted with is cross-border terrorism. If there is agreement at the level of BRICS countries, if there is agreement at the level of the international community as a whole, that we are going to combat terrorism irrespective of what the justification or rationale is, and if we can put pressure on those countries and those organizations which sponsor terrorism or finance terrorism, I think we would have taken a very major step forward.